Thank you for coming this morning. What I would like to share with you is the result of about a year of observation and research, building on an essay that I wrote for Greg last year in a different subject, and now as part of a year-long research project. And the reason why I came to this is that I live in Malaysia, but I've been working in Malaysia for about 20 years in the IT industry. And when I first went there in the 1990s, Malaysia had just declared its ambitious Vision 2020 to become a developed nation by 2020. And a large part of that was the building of the multimedia super corridor and Malaysia's aspiration to become a knowledge-based society. And so having been in and out of Malaysia for 20 years or so, I'd been thinking about this subject and seeing how Malaysia's been tracking against that aspiration. And as a resident of Malaysia and a consultant working in the IT industry, I'd sort of started coming to the view that although Malaysia had been very prescient in setting some of these industrial policies to develop its IT sector, that some aspects of society were missing out on the benefits of that advancement. And so the purpose of this research project was to try and look at what have they done well and where are the opportunities to improve on that. And in particular, in the cybersecurity domain, what would be the opportunity to extend the engagement of civil society and the private sector in this development of the cybersecurity umbrella. So my paper is really in three parts. One is looking at the existing cybersecurity framework, the policies, the regulations, the regulatory agencies and the activities going on in the cyber community today, and to see where there might be opportunities to extend that to better engage civil society in the overall framework. And so I come up with half a dozen ideas, which are preliminary ideas, and I would welcome your feedback today and in the following weeks if you have any suggestions. But these are really just areas of opportunity at this stage. They haven't really been validated through discussion with the Malaysian government. They're ideas I've discussed with some of the people I've interviewed in civil society and in the business community that might be areas in which there could be an extended framework. So I call the paper Cyber Hanruh, which is a shorthand term for total defense. It's a term that Malaysia came up with in the 1980s as an idea to express the need to engage the whole of society in the defense of the country. I think it was invented before there was an intention to include cyber within that, but I think it's a neat way of capturing my intention, which is really to look at how do we move cyber security from just being a government issue to being a whole of society issue. So just to maybe telegraph what I think the final conclusions are here, the areas in which I found that there might be opportunities for civil society and the private sector to become more engaged would be around helping to investigate and prosecute cybercrime, because I think that the police and the government have their hands full and there are limited resources available to do that. So for example, I work in a consulting firm that specializes in forensic investigation of economic crime. I think this, with the Malaysian government's permission, then a private police force could be developed to investigate cybercrime. And I think as part of that, there needs to be some competition policy to encourage the development of a private sector business community outside of the government that provides security services. And maybe part of that is also privatizing the research and development, which until now is very much a government dominated sector. So Malaysia actually has a number of prestigious research institutes. In the ICT sector, there's an organization called MIMOS, which actually has an impressive track record of research and patenting in the ICT community. But just like as in Australia, you know, the challenge has been to commercialise the research that's produced by government research institutes. Malaysia has the same issue. So I think we need to encourage the development of an ecosystem around the government research institutes and also more privately funded research into this area. And then thirdly, I think that there's also an opportunity to look at what other countries are doing in terms of mobilizing civil society. So for example, in China, students graduating from cybersecurity research programs are invited to participate in the defense of the nation. And I think, you know, building on the idea of total defense in Malaysia, there could be a sort of Boy Scouts organization for cybersecurity defenders, or some sort of civil defense organization that could be encouraged on a voluntary basis to provide outreach and extension of cyber skills to the community. So I think similarly, fifthly, there is another area which is information sharing and technical support amongst the private sector and civil society organizations. At the moment, Malaysia has a very strong organization called Cybersecurity Malaysia that provides, for example, a Cyber 999 service. If you have a cyber attack, and even if you're an individual or a small business, you can report your incident to them. But their ability to be able to actually come out and support you to resolve that is limited. So I think that in areas which are outside of the immediate resources of Cybersecurity Malaysia, there's an opportunity for independent organizations to exist which can provide outreach and information sharing in an independent manner, but perhaps in a manner that is supervised by Cybersecurity Malaysia or some other government agency. And the model I'm thinking of for that is the information sharing organizations which have developed in America in the private sector, which maybe operate largely without government involvement, but at least promote a certain level of standardization and sharing amongst particular industry sectors. Then I think similarly there's an opportunity to extend the level of standards in the private sector beyond the existing critical national infrastructure. So if you look at Cybersecurity Malaysia's activities, they're primarily focused on bringing up the level of resilience of the critical infrastructure providers, the banks, the electricity companies, the government agencies, but they don't really extend their services to the small businesses, the supermarkets, the transport companies, other than the large airlines and railway operators. So a lot of those organizations don't really comply to any particular standards. And the trade-off here, I think, is, you know, do you regulate certain standards and force every small business and every church group to comply to the same standards that government agencies do? I think that's too onerous, but maybe there can be more promotion of at least voluntary standards by these civil society, private sector information sharing organizations. And so I think on the whole, there needs to be a stronger level of outreach to civil society other than just what you would read on Cybersecurity Malaysia's website or get exposed to through the government programs in the schools. And lastly, I think as part of that engagement, there's also an opportunity for Malaysia to make this part of their diplomatic strategy, because Malaysia has been very active in leading the Track 2 diplomacy in ASEAN at a government-to-government level. But I think as the whole digital sector in Southeast Asia grows, Malaysia has the opportunity to occupy a prominent role in the leadership of that growth. And part of that would be bringing a stronger presence of Malaysian business into that track to diplomacy. So, for example, what I'm referring to here is Malaysia just recently established a cyber port in Johor to be a hub for electronic commerce in Southeast Asia. And if there could be harmonization of the cybersecurity and regulatory framework for e-commerce that would enable barriers to come down with Indonesia and the Philippines and other countries in the region, then I think e-commerce could be accelerated. So at this point, I think Malaysia has two main dilemmas that it needs to face in its security policy. The first is the tension between self-reliance and indigenous development. It's a long-held tenet of Malaysia's defence policy that Malaysia would like to be a secure and independent and self-reliant state. But I think in this globalized digital commerce economy, then we need to recognize that as small or middle-sized powers, that we don't necessarily have all of the resources at our disposal to defend ourselves in the cyber domain. So I think Malaysia needs to resolve that desire for independence with the need to become part of a globally connected economy. And secondly, I think that, although Malaysia's current cybersecurity framework is quite effective in protecting the core critical national infrastructure, how do they extend that framework to the larger community? Or is the existing framework even fit for purpose for doing such a thing? And I think that that produces some tensions because the existing framework is very government-centric. So if you want to engage all the small business people and the whole of society, how do you find a way of doing that that is not threatening to them? And I think that's particularly challenging in the current political climate. So that's what my paper's about. Now I would like to just illustrate some of the findings and some of the key issues which I had investigated in coming up with these areas of opportunity. So I think, firstly, it's useful to look at it in its historical context, because Malaysia is a young country, and actually Southeast Asia is a region of young countries. And I think that what Professor Ball at ANU said was that in terms of security policy, many of the young countries in Southeast Asia are changing their horizon from having been born in unstable conditions with internal insurgencies and with existential threats to their territory. They're now focusing on what they call self-reliance, which is really looking now to extending their focus to protecting their borders, not just from other nations, but from transnational crimes. So if you have a look at the threats on the Malaysian border with the Philippines, there's a Islamic insurgency, and there's also an ongoing dispute between the Malaysia and the Philippines over who owns Sabah. But I think that now the nations of Southeast Asia are interested in protecting their borders and their resources. A lot of what I think is happening in the South China Sea is about access to resources there, as well as the shipping lanes. So these issues are what inform the risks in the cyber domain. And I will come to that shortly. But I think the other aspect of the historical challenge is that the unresolved human security issues in the area are also contributing to some of the cyber issues. So, for example, the undocumented migrants, the flow of refugees without identity documents creates a large pool of displaced people who have no access to government services and who are effectively marginalised in the economy. And so solving the identities of those people and protecting them from being radicalised or marginalised is part of the cyber challenge. The other thing I think is to look at, if you read Malaysia's defence policy, traditionally Malaysia has relied on its strong partnerships with Western countries through the five-power defence arrangement. But in the last few decades, Malaysia has also sought to develop an independent, non-aligned approach, which I think has put at risk their ability to strongly partner with the US and other Western powers, and potentially, as I mentioned earlier, puts it in a place where it has to be self-reliant on its own indigenous capability. And I think one of the questions that Malaysia has to confront is, does it want to remain in the Western alliance system, or is it going to join the Chinese emerging cybersecurity, Shanghai cooperation type of umbrella, or does it want to try and remain independent in a time when the technology is emerging, is changing so quickly? So if you want to have a look at an example of what is happening in the sort of state-to-state cyber diplomacy environment in Southeast Asia at the moment, there's a lot of patriotic hacking. We were host to the Southeast Asia Games in the last few weeks, and somebody misprinted the Indonesian flag on the brochure for the games, and they put the Indonesian flag upside down. And that caused a number of attacks, which I think in the past would have been aimed at government websites or large corporations. But because Malaysia's cybersecurity framework is so effective now, they picked easier targets, small businesses and individual bloggers, because they were the only ones they could get through to easily. And these sorts of attacks, I think, go on all the time. Malaysian bloggers attack Indonesian bloggers, Filipinos attack Malaysians, and vice versa. This is quite pervasive, and this is a sort of low-level noise in the background. But I think that as the critical national infrastructure becomes more resilient, these attacks are spilling over into the whole of society. And this is the kind of stuff you have to deal with if you're running a small business now. I think perhaps more significantly is the cyber threat that exists in the crime arena. Malaysia, unfortunately, is at the centre of a large region in which there are a lot of security issues occurring, and it has been exploited by transnational criminal gangs as an attractive base for the operation of international operations targeting extortion and money laundering, where the victims may be in America or in Europe or Australia, but it's just a great place to run a criminal business because the police resources are limited and the enforcement of border controls is a little bit lax. So if Malaysian police round up the criminals and deport them, they'll come back again with a new passport. So Malaysia needs to find a way of tamping down this sort of hub of cyber criminal activity. And unfortunately, it's a mixture of crimes that are just purely internet-based crimes, like extortion or child pornography online, but also traditional crimes. So with or without the internet, Malaysia is on the human trafficking route, and there are stateless people being pushed down from Myanmar and other places who are finding Malaysia as a temporary home, and there are cyber aspects to their to their journeys. And it's also a major trafficking route for drugs, wildlife, timber smuggling, and counterfeit goods. It just happens to sit at the middle of a region where there's a lot of flows in criminal activity. And these days, because so much commerce is online, then there's an online aspect to those traditional crimes. And I think the problem here is that the police have only got a limited capacity to respond to this. So there are aid organisations who are extending training to the Malaysian police and to the Malaysian judiciary. But I think that there's an opportunity for the private sector to come in and augment that, at least in relation to commercial crimes. So just taking a step back and looking at the commercial aspect of the opportunity, I think one thing that Malaysia has really excelled in is anticipating the growth of the digital economy. So if you look back to the 1990s with the announcement of Vision 2020, Malaysia laid down some early preparations for protecting society against cybercrime, one of which was the publication of the Cybercrime Act. And they also were one of the first countries in the world to establish a computer emergency response team. And they have continued to also develop out their industrial policy, identifying specific technologies, including cybersecurity technologies, as part of their state-centric top-down planning for the development of the economy. And we're now at a point where Malaysia is preparing a new 30-year plan to take it from 2020 to 2050, which is involving civil society and business through a series of sort of roundtable, town hall type workshops around the country. And I think that this now provides an important recognition that not just in the security domain, but in the economic domain, that the economy has got so complex that this can no longer just be a centrally planned initiative. It needs to be something that is also built bottom up. And I think that in some of those TN50 cybersecurity discussions, one of the large pieces of feedback from the community was, we would like to see this not just be a once-off exercise, we would like to see this continue and become a regular thing. So the challenge for the Malaysian government, I think, is to make a transformation in their planning style, because I think this is not a government administration that is used to taking such a bottom-up approach. But I think they've already taken the first few steps. So in terms of the size of the opportunity for Malaysia, the Malaysian government and A.T. Kearney had recently done a study to try and understand what was the current size of the contribution to the economy. It's about 5 or 6% of the total GDP at the moment, and it's growing at about 6 or 7% a year, which is quite impressive. But the growth of the digital economy in Malaysia is lagging the world leaders by a significant margin. So compared to countries like Singapore or even European countries, the growth rate is probably about a third of what the leaders have achieved. And one of the key things that A.T. Kearney pointed out was that the growth rate is being constrained by people's lack of trust in the cyber environment. So people aren't trusting of electronic payment channels. They're not trusting of the logistics and delivery for parcels online. And they're not trusting that their identity will be protected. And the issue is not just a Malaysian issue, because actually Bank Negara, the central bank, has identified that secure payments are quite possible in Malaysia. But if you're paying for something from Indonesia, that's a problem. Or you're using a foreign credit card. So I think part of the challenge here is to stop thinking about this being purely a Malaysian problem. This is actually now a regional or global problem, and just fixing the Malaysian part of it is no longer enough. Just lastly, on the economic side of this, I think, as I had mentioned before, Malaysia actually has quite an impressive track record of research into ICT technologies, but its ability to commercialize those is constrained, as it is in many other countries too. In a series of recent studies, the OECD and the World Bank had pointed out one of the fundamental problems is, again, the government's lack of openness and transparency. Even within government departments, different government departments can be using different data to look at the same issue. And then in this broader civil society, researchers such as ourselves find it difficult to get access to recent, accurate, consistent government statistics to be able to make sensible policy recommendations or to become involved in the debate. And so, for example, the publication record of Malaysian independent researchers is relatively low. It's not substantially lower than other small emerging countries, but it's not great, and it significantly lags leaders like Singapore. So, for example, if you look at the World Bank's research onto use of open data, it finds that Malaysia sits in the same sort of category of other countries in the region like the Philippines or Thailand, but it's not up with the leaders like Hong Kong and Singapore or even Japan and Australia. And if you look at the performance of Malaysian research and development in the global economy, one of the simple measures is US patents, because if you invent something for the global economy, you'll usually try and patent it in the US. Malaysian researchers really aren't performing much better than China. And China's putting a lot more effort in than Malaysia is. Interestingly, other countries in the East Asian region like Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong and Singapore really stand out for their achievement in commercializing their research. US patents. Oh, sorry, this one? This is publication per capita. It's a log scale. This is an index assigned by the World Bank researchers on the relative availability of open government data. So, zooming out, if you have a look at the picture today in Southeast Asia on the conditions that have been created for the growth of the digital economy, Malaysia has actually ticked a lot of the boxes. And I believe that's why if you look at the sort of standard international indexes published by the International Telecommunications Union or the World Economic Forum, you'll see Malaysia consistently come out high or very high in the international scores. They have set the regulatory frameworks, they have established the agencies. Their challenge now is to operationalize that and to move that beyond just the critical national infrastructure. So if you have a look at Malaysia's cybersecurity policy, they have 8 key objectives. Their objectives are to establish effective governance for cybersecurity, put the regulatory framework in place, do research and development, build a culture of security, establish compliance, and test their readiness. And I think, again, they've ticked most of the boxes. The challenge is, when you look into the detail, those things have really only been done for the critical national infrastructure, and those things have only been done in a varying way. So, for example, if you look at the banking sector is actually very, very closely regulated and enjoy good cooperation with the central bank. But if you look at the transport sector, maybe a couple of major national airlines are close participants in this program. When you get down to trucking companies and small shipping companies or ports, the compliance is less strong. How are we doing for time?
Doing very well.
Okay. So when you come to looking at indexes, as I mentioned, Malaysia actually scores very highly in the group of emerging and developed economies. I think the challenge is to break that down and drill a little bit deeper and see what's driving that. I think, again, you know, a lot of the indexes are kind of box-ticking exercises. That do you have a cybercrime policy, yes or no? If you do, then you score highly. The question in my mind is, how well do you enforce it? And so one of the ways I think you can see the problems that emerge is if you look at Malaysian cybercrime statistics. One source, obviously, is Cybersecurity Malaysia, which is the agency which you can report a cyber attack to. It's voluntary, it's not compulsory, and particularly if you're not part of the critical national infrastructure, then you may not really have much of an incentive to report it. So I think we have to take these as being just a proxy and a fraction of the real volume of cyber incidents that are going on. But if you look at Cybersecurity Malaysia's reported incidents, it's very interesting to see that sometime around 2011, there was this massive global expansion of cyber attacks that we've seen everywhere else. And a large part of what was driving that was just annoying but not particularly damaging attacks on websites and denial of service attacks. And so when you filter those numbers and take out the spam and the not particularly serious issues, you still see a huge spike. And a large part of what's driving that is the reported incidence of fraud, which is a serious issue. And I think the problem here, you know, as I mentioned about the digital economy, is if fraud gets out of control, then people stop trusting the electronic domain for their commerce. So if you compare that with what the Malaysian police say that they've been dealing with, the shape of the curve is quite similar, but the volume of cases is much smaller. And this is part of the problem I was talking about open government data, that obviously the Malaysian police and Cybersecurity Malaysia haven't actually synchronized their data sets. But if you have a look at the shape of the ones that the police have been investigating, I think most of them, it looks more like a replica of the fraud curve. So I think most of this is the serious stuff, and it looks pretty consistent. I've tried to sort of harmonize the indexes so that you can see compare them across, and I think they look roughly the same, but there is a discrepancy, and it's the stuff that's above the curve in the Cybersecurity Malaysia graph. So what are these things that are incidents that are going on that are not being treated as crimes by the police? And I think it's difficult to say, but I think anecdotally, for example, we can see a lot of transnational crime, which the police are not willing to investigate because the victim is not a Malaysian citizen or resident. It's also the kind of pernicious stuff like child pornography and exploitation, which the police may not necessarily be motivated or resourced to investigate. I spoke to some people who have access to helping the Malaysian police with their incident reporting databases, and I think part of the problem is that the police statistics don't necessarily capture some of the pernicious cyber crimes. So I think there's a real problem in the quality of the data. But if you look at the results, I think that Malaysia actually has a good reason to give itself a pat on the back for the work it's done in the critical national infrastructure. And in recent annual tests, which the Cybersecurity Malaysia agency performed, they've now started achieving fairly consistently high rankings across most of the critical infrastructure industries. And I think that they're seeing the fruits of that collaboration. But the question is whether that collaboration model between Cybersecurity Malaysia and the big banks and the utility companies is really fit for purpose when we're now trying to extend this arrangement to support people who just run small businesses or who are trying to just run a household. One of the reasons why I think they've been so successful is that they mandated the adoption of international security management system standards and enforced compliance to those standards amongst at least the major critical infrastructure players. So, summing up, I think Malaysia has actually anticipated early the need for a security framework. They put in the legislation and the regulatory frameworks, the agencies, the training, the adoption of standards to be able to protect the critical infrastructure. And now their challenge is how to extend that to protecting the rest of the community. And then as I mentioned before, I think I saw 6 or 8 key areas in which that can be done. I think if you have a look at the barriers to success, though, there's a number of significant issues. One of the key ones being the political appetite to be able to extend government support to individuals and to small businesses. In the current polarized political environment, then I think a lot of people who are not part of the government community are probably a little bit suspicious of working with the government. And so I think the challenge is to set up some kind of arrangement that's independent enough for people to trust it, but also close enough that the government can perhaps influence some of the standards at least, to be able to make sure that there's some coordination overall. So if you look, for example, at what's been done in the US, there's a patchy sort of record of creating arm's length information sharing organizations in the private sector, but we need to look at the lessons learned from that. And my paper tries to build on some research done by a couple of leading American academics called Goldsmith and Eggers, who looked into the success of public-private partnerships in the US. And they made some simple conclusions, one of which is there needs to be a strong alignment of the interests of the parties. If you go into a joint venture or some other kind of a business relationship without having aligned the interests of those parties at more than just a simple economic level, then the partnership is probably going to fail at some point. So, for example, if the government just simply says, you must share all your cyber attacks with us, then business people might say, that's your job, not ours, and we don't have the money to pay for that. So I think there needs to be a sort of recognition up front in the design of these partnerships that those things need to be talked about and resolved before they're institutionalized. So I've tried to rank my recommendations in terms of feasibility, and I think maybe the simplest thing to say at the moment is one thing that everybody is united on is the need to sustain economic growth, because that's the source of stability and wealth in society, and we all see the digital economy growing, and we want it to grow faster. So I think one of the simplest areas is to engage the business community with the government in the next round of diplomacy in ASEAN towards harmonizing e-commerce and cybercrime standards and getting better cooperation not just between the government and policing agencies, but also between the businesses who are actually interested in growing a Southeast Asian e-commerce business, and that can be done under the umbrella of ASEAN economic integration. The other area which I think is low-hanging fruit is to look at how do we actually open up competition in the Malaysian cyber market. So I think we need to put behind this policy of independence and now think of the Malaysian cyber market as being part of a global market. And so government tenders need to be open to all players. There needs to be an open market for global companies to invest and operate and do business from Malaysia, and also tap into the Southeast Asian market. Moving down, I think some of the more challenging areas to address will be those that are dependent on breaking through the traditional sort of crony capitalist kind of protected market conditions which occur in Malaysia. And I think maybe there needs to be a new way of thinking about how the civil society engages with the government in economic planning. And TN50, which is the new 30-year plan that Malaysia is developing, I think provides the first sort of shining example that needs to be built upon. So that's really, those are the key conclusions of my research so far.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, thank you very much. Great presentation. I've got a few questions, but ladies and gentlemen, let's hear yours.
I've got a question about, so some fascinating insights there, really terrific. Interested in, like, you've done some great quant there as well, and looking at the stats, which obviously is a shared problem we all have, and so there's some interesting outcomes there. I'm wondering how you might measure trust. Like, it seems like trust is a figure that we're thinking about.
Yes.
How might we measure trust?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I work with one of the accounting firms in Malaysia, and it's actually sponsoring a trust award with major corporations who are trying to establish that through transparency in their financial reporting. So I think there are many dimensions to it, because to me that's not enough. I think since we're talking about trust between individuals and small businesses in the institutions of society, not just in the big corporations, but also in the media and in the government, I think if you have a look at the research done by Pew in the US, for example, they survey people about their trust in the media and in other institutions. And interestingly, Malaysia scores pretty lowly in that, but it doesn't stand out. I mean, trust around the world is eroding. But very interestingly, their next door neighbor, Indonesia, has the highest level of trust in the media of any country in the world. So I think that indicates the potential to address the problem too.
Thanks. Always. Go back to your slide on the where you showed the peak in attacks and then the decline. To shadow another area of conversation, I'd like to cyber volunteers. So one of the interesting things in China, which is the parallel there, I think in the right-hand graphic, is that there's been a decline in overall number of attacks, but an increase in the value of loss recorded.
Yes.
It's partly perhaps a statistical phenomenon where more information becomes available, but it seems that the value of the highest losses is going up. So that's
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. But I think that, personally, I think that one possible explanation is that there's a bit of fine-tuning in the data collection methods. So, for example, around 2011, Cybersecurity Malaysia stopped reporting spam as a type of attack because spam just went through the roof. I think similarly there's been a fine-tuning of the cases which the police are willing to look at. And so therefore, if they're only looking at the more significant cases, then the average value of the case they look at has gone up. What this data reflects is the scores which came out of Malaysia's regular cybersecurity readiness exercise, which they were originally intended to be an annual exercise, hasn't been quite annual, because I think that they've experienced some problems with engaging all the stakeholders and designing a rigorous framework for that. So, for example, one of the issues that came up in the early exercises was if we design a test case, it might be a good test case for one industry, but it's completely unrepresentative of another. And so, one group of participants might say this thing's a waste of time, and the other ones might say this is actually quite useful. But I think one of the advantages Malaysia has here is its small size, because compared to America, for example, there's a smaller number of participants, and actually many of the participants in these sectors are actually either government-owned or government-linked corporations. So when Cybersecurity Malaysia wants to get these people together, they can probably get them into one room. And I think maybe that's one reason why they've been able to achieve relatively good scores from these exercises, because they've been able to coordinate the sectors. And part of what they're testing here is the ability of, say, the banking industry participants to share information with the telecommunications providers to resolve a test case. I think, though, I particularly agree with your point about these not necessarily being representative of the true state of affairs, because we've yet to see a really public incident occur of a real-world major disaster in the cyber environment in Malaysia. It may have happened, but we haven't heard about it. So these are just sort of exercise scores. Well, I think that the original intention of Hanruh was that it was to bring civil society and the government together in a spirit of national unity to respond to national security threats. And it was probably intended originally in the traditional defence domain, but it's also been extended to disaster response. And so my idea is let's extend that into the cyber domain by perhaps encouraging volunteer organisations to provide some outreach to the local community to help them to address cyber attacks. So if you have a computer that's been seized up by ransomware, bring it to the local civil defence group and see if we can help you to unlock it or clean it.
Is that happening? There are volunteer groups like that?
Well, I think there's a lot of volunteer groups in Malaysian society, and I think that those groups could be harnessed in this. So, for example, there is a independent civil society organisation for protecting families and households against crime, victims of crime, and those people have actually recently announced a cyber program. So I think there would be an opportunity to extend those kind of early initiatives into setting up a nationwide kind of a network to provide that kind of outreach.
Okay, we'll have a final question. Anybody else got a question? Okay, my final question is, based on what you know about Malaysia and the region more broadly, based on your studies, would you like to revisit the implications of Malaysia's early start? Has Malaysia squandered that early start, or has it really sort of kept up the pace?
I think the early start set a really strong foundation, which maybe averted what might have otherwise been a much more serious and harmful situation emerging. So if you compare what's happening in other countries in the region like the Philippines or Indonesia, then I think you can see the impact of not having the kind of level of preparedness that Malaysia has. But I think Malaysia now needs to say, that's great, but that's putting us on a certain trajectory with the critical infrastructure, and now we need to be prepared to take a blank sheet of paper and think about what the future demands of us.
So you'd expect that there'd be more detail on cybersecurity in the next 30-year plan?
I think there will be, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, on